Uh, yeah, you kind of have to know about that.
Yes.
So now, yeah, what about that one?
It's decoration.
I see. Okay, cool.
It's
Yeah,
it's easier to have them hanging up there than to be in the way.
yeah.
Um, the basic theory in lighting is what is called three-point lighting.
Mm-hmm.
This goes back pretty much forever ago. Uh, the idea is that there is a key light, which is the principal light source.
Right.
There is a fill light that fills in. If you just have the key light, you get harsh shadows. But the whole point of the key light is have it off axis so you get some modeling of the face.
Right.
But you don't want it stark. And sometimes do. I mean, a lot of
Yeah,
lighting
yeah,
is.
but usually not. Yeah.
Well, it depends on the circumstances. If you're going for drama, you want dramatic effects, and you want strange lighting. But the standard model is a key light that defines whatever it is you're taking a picture of, the person, a fill light to reduce the shadows, and a backlight to provide separation from the background.
Right.
If you have a light behind you, it tends to separate you out from the background so you don't blend into the background. And that's pretty much it. And then it's variations on a theme.
Right.
And the key light historically was basically treated as a point source. You remember the old Fresnels with the glass lenses. The whole point of that was to get essentially parallel light streams confined, so you got a very much a point source. And then the fill light was a broader source. It's what those umbrellas were intended to do, which is to give you a broad source, which is essentially it reduces the shadow from the key light, but it doesn't create other shadows. You will see the CBC comes to mind when they're doing their nightly newscast, the national. Inevitably, in a studio, they've got so many lights that you end up with two noses. One shadow goes this way and one shadow goes this way. And the whole point of the fill light, key light establishes the shadow, the fill light gets rid of, reduces the shadow, but
sharpness.
And the reason the light, the fill light typically is just either right at the camera or just off of it, so you don't get that secondary shadow. Which is not an issue if you've got a high if this is a much brighter source, but if it's a broad source, you get essentially a flat lighting, and then you can do variations on the theme. From there, you can go anywhere. What most lighting now, they tend to use broader sources. So you don't have those stark shadows unless you're going essentially for dramatic. There is also, it's like anything else, it's trendy, and you will now see lots of high key from the side, which in the old days would have been anathema. Now it's artistic. You have no fill over here, high key back, and so you just you see this face sort of coming out at you. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And if once you get used to the idea, you can basically set up your lights, according to theory, and then look at what you're seeing and adjust accordingly.
Right. Well, so for our poetry, we have an audience of maybe 100 people, and the light's coming from the side. The reason that we don't set up the light is people come in throughout,
you can't
they're stumbling over the lights and stuff.
The liability that goes with that is not worth the effect. The problem, this is characteristic in the world at large, stage lighting and film lighting, movie lighting are radically different animals. And when people build spaces that are performing spaces, the lighting is always bad for television. In fact, the lighting generally is bad anyway. If it is a sophisticated stage operation, and the people who designed it knew what they were doing, and the people who are using it know what they're doing, you can get wonderful effects with stage lighting. You got so many lights you can put them. The major problem with stage lighting is that it's all up here,
Right.
which gives you wonderful shadows under your eyes. You can't see people's eyes, and since the eye is the window to the soul, it creates problems that you can't see people's eyes. And we just Kimberly built a conference center 6 or 8 years ago, and it's the same mistakes.
There are consequences to eye level lighting. So sometimes we would have these two lights from the side. So they're basically projecting out into the street. They go to the podium where the person is, but then they go beyond. So we would have cars turning the street, and then the driver getting blinded by our lights. So we realized
That's not
that
good.
yeah that we cannot have them projecting out at eye level. This is a hazard.
The basic thinking is to replicate the sun.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, unless you want to recreate a campfire, which is a radically different animal. But the assumption is the sun is right there, or right there, and typically on either on a cloudy day, or if you're in some place where there's enough light bouncing around, that essentially provides the fill light, which reduces the harsh shadow. And the whole thinking on lighting originally was essentially to replicate what the sun does. What the sun, in combination with all the bounce that goes on from the sun, and then you start doing variations on a theme. What they should be doing is putting lights, and actually they did that here in Studio 64, and where they, which is the small theater space here. It's a nice little space, and they did. The lighting is out over the audience, which is where it should be.
Yeah.
What it allows you to do is avoid all the kinds of problems that you're talking about. The other problem, of course, is if you're not careful, you're also going to blind the audience.
Right.
If you've got essentially that light, an audience there, the only problem is that the performer can't see the audience as well. Sorry.
Yeah.
But if it's up high enough, or you leave the house lights on, there are lots of different ways to address that.
So what about types of lights? Incandescent, fluorescent, LED, multicolor.
There is this thing called color temperature. Do you know about color temperature?
Yeah, a little bit.
Basically it's based on the temperature of tungsten. The standard in film and television for a long time was 3,200 degrees Kelvin, which if you compared it to outside light, exterior is somewhere between 5,200 and 6,000. It's much bluer. The tungsten is a much redder by comparison, and there are all sorts of filtering things you can do. The item number one is to make sure that you don't mix sources, because then you can't. The human eye is much more flexible looking at the world around them than a camera is. Cameras now are much more forgiving than they used to be. But if you mix, say, fluorescent with daylight, you're going to get, most fluorescent lights are green. What you don't want to do is use fluorescents.
Yeah.
With the exception, they make fluorescent lights that are 3,200 degrees. They're special purpose. They're made for television, or 6,000 degrees, which basically daylight. And if you use those, then you get good lighting. There has been a major change with LEDs. The whole business changed. It used to be two things. In the old days, it took an incredible amount of light to get a good image, which is why, if you go to an old studio or a television studio that was built anywhere more than 10 or 15 years ago. They got high ceilings, lights all over the place, big Fresnels, 4,000 watt fixtures, lots of them. And the reason was you had to get a tremendous amount of light in to get a good image.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the technology has changed. Both the film and the early film stocks required a stunning amount of light. The film stocks got better. The television cameras have gotten better. These kinds of things are now available. They're all solid state. So the issue of amount of light went away. You can get remarkably good images with very little light. And with LEDs, you can get a lot more light with a lot less power. And what we are using principally, well, actually this is actually a fluorescent lamp, but it's 6,000 degrees.
Yeah.
That's an LED. It's 6,000 degrees. That's fluorescent. It's 6,000. This one is, I think, fluorescent. 6,000. The rule one is to not mix.
Mm-hmm.
Rule two is avoid standard fluorescents because inevitably they're green.
Yeah.
And people do not look good. When they look green, they look sick. You as a pathologist can relate to that. You don't want, by and large, you don't want the people you're going to the trouble of taking pictures of looking sick.
Now, what we frequently have as an issue, like if you have a 60-inch screen like this one, and somebody's speaking beside it, if the screen is really bright, then you get, you know, it's hard to sort of compensate for both, right?
Again, the human eye, you can more or less handle 8 to 12 f-stops from white to black.
Yeah.
In the old days, television, particularly film, was a little more forgiving, but television, 4 was about the best you could do. So, if you've got a bright light and nothing, you got a problem.
Yeah, yeah.
And particularly if you're shooting into a light source, which a television is,
Right.
the only way to deal with it is to crank the contrast down and turn the brightness down until you get it down to whatever it is that you've got in front of it, beside it. Unfortunately, what happens when you do that is you can't see the television. Anybody sitting out there can't see the television. One of the serious mistakes that people make when people now are using their telephones to do interviews, which is, it's convenient, but inevitably people think they will look better with a window behind them. Which makes the television look trivial by comparison, because it's the color temperature typically is going to be different, but more than that, it's going to be 8 or 10 f-stops, which basically means you end up with a silhouette.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's no known cure for that. I mean, there are things you can do in post, but ultimately what you've got is a mistake.
Right. So probably in a lot of situations, if the color is a little off, it doesn't matter. But in photography of flowers, I think most people have the experience these days of the pictures just being the same color. They may be prettier, but they're not real.
Well,
so, yeah.
The camera doesn't know.
Yeah.
It does not understand the light source. The trick. I think Paul was telling me about this. This tells me what the color should be. And if I really cared, I've got what is called a vector scope that would allow me to look at all these colors and put them exactly where they're supposed to be.
I see.
By any light source.
Right.
More simply, if you get white right, and you get black right, and you get gray right, everything else falls into place. That's the theory.
Yeah.
And it's it's pretty close. Again, if you've got a constant light source, but if you start mixing light sources, the camera doesn't know what to do. I think the phrase is "shit or go blind," and it just it will pick something, which is what you're talking about with the flowers. the trick, I mean, this is why every time we start with this, so I have a reference, and since we're in a fixed space, which is why we like studios, and why studios, that's why movies get shot in studios, because you can control all the factors, you can control the lighting, you can control the weather, you can control the audio, everything's much easier. But when the first thing I do when we record is record this. So when I start putting it together, I can go back and adjust if I need to, and make sure that the color balance is right for that particular circumstance. The good news is in our studio, particularly, I mean, this is essentially a fixed setup for us. And, so I can walk in, turn on the lights, hit play, and be fairly close.
Right.
But the cameras will wander off sometimes if you leave them alone for a while.
They have a mind of their own.
They may not come back the way that you left them.
Now let me ask you something you may not know anything about, because I think it's a consumer camera feature that I don't think any high-end camera has. So Sony Smile Shutter gets still images with symmetrical smiles and hand gestures and that sort of thing. It's a proprietary thing that Sony came out with, I'm saying 10, 12 years ago. It's a feature actually in all of their camcorders, at least the low-end ones that I might buy. It's so mundane now that they don't even mention it. I was crushed when I purchased this, and it's not mentioned in the specs, but it's still there. So, and it's a way to sort of judge the success of any social event. Like, if you were really upset during this and didn't smile once, it wouldn't capture a single picture. It can capture like 200, 300 pictures an hour if the person has symmetrical hand gestures and smiles and that sort of thing. And quite honestly, my best pictures are from it. So it's pictures taken by a machine compared to ones that I take where I'm thinking I'd make a good picture. It takes a few seconds for me to get myself organized. And in my life, this takes much better pictures than I do, and many more. So my 68,000 pictures on Facebook, most of them are taken by Sony Smile Shutter software, deciding instantaneously that part of the video feed would make a very good.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, you see? Anyway, so it's such an important part of my life, but I think you can understand why is it left out of specs these days? It just isn't sexy. Nobody except Kim Solez loves Sony Smile Shutter. So, yeah.
Well, part of the challenge, and it's true with the technology, they can do so many things, they just can't resist. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like cars now.
Yeah.
Everything, it drives for you or not. It runs over pedestrians. You don't have to.
Right. Yeah.
And the idea is, it's convenience. I mean, people want things to be convenient.
Yeah.
And they want it to work the way they want it to work, but they don't know enough to know how to make it work. So the machine steps in and.
Right. So if you think of pictures of people who are in good athletic shape, holding both arms over their heads like that, you would never take a picture like that as a posed picture, but this thing really loves those. So you get people, it's sort of like, lecturers who are also swimming champions, you get very interesting poses.
This is a Japanese version of what people should look like.
Yes.
And now it has become the standard because the Japanese have imposed it.
Yeah.
So now everybody thinks this is what you're supposed to look like.
Yeah. So,
if you're doing this in the same space all the time.
No, we aren't. So, like, if you look at my videos, you would realize that the poetry sessions on Tuesday evening are remarkably different from the videos that I shoot in my office at work. The office, you probably know the concept of lean processing, of like not having anything extra, not having inventory accumulate, a smoothly running company, and so on. So the medical...
Which Donald Trump is going to destroy with his trade policy.
Yes, yes.
The supply chains are going to be so messed up.
Yes. Yeah. So, the world's expert on medical lean processes visited us. I was terrified because I thought probably all the beautiful stuff in my office that students and I have provided over the years would, upset him. And so we carefully explained the origin and the fact that from our point of view, all pictures of lean processes look like creativity is completely absent, right? There's never any art. There's never anything extra. You just see like the stuff we make and the chairs and the tables,
It's utilitarian.
Yeah.
Which lacks a certain aesthetic content.
Yeah. So he accepted that. And the book chapter we've recently written about the room, which is called Cyber Nephrology, which is where my office is shared with these young people that I'm training, he declared that is compatible with lean processes, as cluttered and colorful.
I would like for you to put more art in there. I think two things.
Right.
Art and get rid of the damn fluorescents or replace it.
Right.
Fluorescent lighting is utilitarian.
Yeah.
It gives you flat light through the entire space. That's why they invented them. That's why they built. That's why they have the diffusers.
Right.
Aesthetically, not so much.
Yeah.
And particularly if the color temperature is off. But
so we could change that, right? We could put 6,000.
You could change the color temperature. It's still flat light.
Yeah.
But at least it would make the interior. You've got windows in there. It would make the color of the outside and the inside continuous, which would open up the entire space.
Yeah.
You wouldn't feel like you were outside, particularly on a winter's day.
Yeah.
But you'd have the continuity from outside to inside, and we grew up as a species. Our light was that light.
Right.
Everything else is unnatural, except however many million years ago we started rubbing sticks together, or flint knapping, or whatever we did. But there's a lot. Architects pay virtually no attention to lighting. And occasionally you'll get somebody who'll do the lobby, they'll spotlights and stuff, if there's something they want to feature. But by and large, they just don't pay any attention to it, even in theaters, unless it's a high-end theater.
Right.
But the auditoriums and schools, the conference facilities and hotels are awful. The acoustics are bad. The lighting is bad. The ambience is bad. The food is bad.
Yeah.
And all of that is addressable, and the cost differential is minor. It's just you have to pay attention to it. But if you go back and look at that space and think about lighting, obviously the utilitarian. I mean, it is a workspace, and there's a certain value in having the utilitarian perspective. But you can achieve. I mean, you've been there long enough. You know what you want to do,
right? And
you can create light. You can control space with light, essentially.
Right.
You can control the emotions. Control overstates it. You can influence emotions by the lighting.
Yeah.
You can put lights on dimmers, or you can contrasted to what I just said. You could go to a warmer temperature, the 3200, or incandescent lights are probably in the mid to low 2000s. But essentially what that does is recreate candlelight or firelight, which is is a different atmosphere, and the atmosphere affects how people. And you can, if you really wanted to waste a lot of time, you could look at your calendar and say, well, this is the atmosphere I want on this day or for this event, and this is the
Right.
atmosphere. And you flip a switch and you get the daylight look for, something that involves lots of people and a sense of the energy that goes to daylight.
Right.
Or if you are having a one-on-one conversation that's fairly intense, but you want people to feel comfortable in it, then you shift off to the red end of the spectrum, and people feel more intimate, they feel closer, they feel like they're gathered around the fire, it's a romantic dinner or whatever. But
Yeah.
all those things are doable, and nobody pays attention to it. I'm just stunned.
Yeah. It's interesting having a unique space and actually working in it as I do. Sometimes dramatic things happen that are just not actionable at all. So my chairman, my superior from about 20 years ago, shows up one day. He has a wedding in town. He's in Edmonton, and he has some time. He can't think of anything else to do but come to see me. And he walks in and he says, "You need new carpet. This is the original carpet from 1986. But I'm realizing, so we're in a situation, all of laboratory medicine in northern Alberta is moving to a new hub facility in 2022. So we can't renovate, we can't do anything because we're spending a huge amount of money in this new place. So I know I'm not getting new carpet. And I think you would also know that actually the carpet in the room, it may shock somebody coming in, but from a video shoot point of view, the carpet's not
The only time you get in, you can, if you've got a lot of bright lighting, you will get reflection. But that's if you've got green carpet and you're reflecting light off it, and then people turn green again.
Right.
But that's way down the list. And the good news about a carpet, of course, is it helps a great deal with the acoustics.
Yeah.
And again, the acoustics, people don't pay attention to the acoustics.
Yeah.
And particularly the kind of space you're working, people need to be able to talk to one another. They need to be able to hear one another.
Yeah. No, I've been shooting videos in that room for 4 or 5 years now, and actually the things that do happen are not bad. The door opening and closing is a very distinctive sound, and sometimes it's exactly what you need. Things are going along, you're thinking, well, this is pretty boring. Somebody opens the damn door, you God, what happened there? And the chair squeaks. You will find that our trailer for my channel on YouTube, how could any trailer start with a chair squeak? But it's so much better than the others that we shot. I just thought, where'd you going to leave the damn chair squeak in there? So that's the first thing you hear. You hear the chair first, then Ashita, then me. And that's been watched now over 400 times.
Well, part of it, in a lot of ways, what you're doing is utilitarian.
Yeah.
But you're not in a sell mode overtly.
Right.
And people are there because they want the content. They're not there to be entertained.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is a very different animal.
Right.
The reason all of this stuff in the studios are studios, you can't make people go to the movies.
Right. Right.
You have to
It's
do
a
something that
voluntary
is appealing to them for them to fork out a huge amount of money,
Yeah.
plus the popcorn, plus the
Right.
to come watch your creation, which is a very different animal from what you're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I recognize that. Now, I'm sure you have the same sort of stories of videos, movies you shot that have changed the lives of the people in them, like within days. As a student, Aisha Harian, her final project, she was talking about artificial intelligence. Anyway, she did a takeoff on Shakespeare, the immortal coil. So we put it up on YouTube. There was a new startup in New York City that was looking for somebody to be in charge of their social media. They saw her video. They offered her a job. She moved to New York City. She's sort of been there ever
Great.
since, And other things like that have happened. I told you about shy people becoming unshy, sort of right in front of us, feeling kind of empowered by this ability to project themselves in a way that they never had. So you must have had, or are all of your people so experienced that it's just a little blip in their lives and nothing changes?
It's not typically not the kind of dramatic. The impact tends to be on the audience, not
Yeah,
we've had
not
people,
the person.
and it's the surprising thing to me over the years has been the things you think are the important things rarely are.
Right.
I will have people come out, something that happened 10 years ago, and they say, I remember that scene. And this person said that, and I couldn't even remember the person.
Right.
Or I can remember, but what I remember is the things that I thought were
Right.
important. And he said, it changed my life.
Right.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, and
I say that? Did he say that?
like we have some things like that, the things that are left out. They don't seem to be left out to us, but you can say, well, of course they are. So we had one lecture that is entitled, "Is Evil a Treatable Disease?" And the lecturer actually didn't answer that, but didn't even talk about that question. But it's a fascinating lecture about autism and whether Hitler was autistic and all this kind of thing. Marilyn Monroe, how do Hitler and Marilyn Monroe compare and stuff like this. Right. But so people would come back to me and say he never answered the question. So you can imagine what happened next. We did a follow-up video where once again the lecturer thought this is such a dumb thing to actually answer the question posed by the title of the video. So the second time he did not answer it. And it's kind of boring. I mean, suppose I were to say, yes, evil is a treatable disease, you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, I mean, you get nothing about the subtlety of life if you think that evil is a treatable disease. Or no, it isn't. Then you say, well, that's also a completely unsatisfactory answer. You mean there's no hope for us then?
It's treatable, it's not curable.
Yes, that's right. So,
apparently, all the evidence is that it's not curable.
Yeah.
Actually, it is. Now that I think about it, that's what wars are about. You eliminate it.
Yes.
That's one way to treat it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it has consequences that are not good.
Yeah. So now, what about costumes? I can tell you that last Halloween, I encourage everybody in my class that I teach to come costumed, but we're a democratic society, and they have reached adulthood, and that comes with the ability to make your own decisions, right? So I show up wearing my NASA spacesuit, ready to fly up to the shuttle, and they're all uncostumed. So you might say, well, doesn't that mean that particular video is completely wrecked? No. Actually, some people that's the only video of mine, they think, well, maybe he always dresses like that.
Yeah,
Who knew?
Yeah, video has now become a popular medium. That was not until a decade ago. It was it took lots of money.
Yeah.
When the first company, our production company, we probably had $2 to $3 million in equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was just, it was professional equipment, and that's what it cost to do it. And
Right.
The first camera we bought, and this was well down the path, I think was probably $120,000.
Yeah.
And probably didn't get an image any better, and probably not as good as what you got there. So the whole thing has changed. And I think we're still trying to figure out how to use the medium, and I worry about debasing the currency, but it's a stupid worry because it's going to be debased.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
get used
it
to
is.
it.
I mean, everybody. So I realized. I mean, for a long time, I had actual cameras. So when I was taking pictures, I would take a camera with me, and I kept getting the newest iPhone.
Shining, yeah.
Eventually, this is ridiculous. My phone takes better pictures than my camera does. So,
Well, the technical specs, all right, you have to be careful. The specs will tell you one thing, and that's not that they're misrepresenting it.
yeah,
It's what they're specifying is not necessarily correlated with the user experience, the viewer experience.
right,
The fact that it's a high resolution camera maybe, or that it shoots, well, high resolution. You can have a high resolution camera and bad glass.
yeah,
And again, the first lenses we put on those $100,000 cameras were $10,000 or $15,000 lenses.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
obviously that's changed, but the technology of glass has not moved anywhere as quickly as the technology of the recording medium.
Right.
We've gone from videotape, well, from film to videotape, to digital, whatever. At fairly high resolutions. I mean, you can record whatever the system. I mean, if you want to spend enough, you can get whatever resolution you want.
Yeah.
The glass is a different animal, and it has not moved anywhere near as quickly as the encoding mechanism. And it turns out glass is really important. And the other thing, and this one doesn't matter with what you're doing, but I'll say it anyway since we're talking about lighting. You want to keep light out of the lens.
Yes. Yeah.
Not just because you get flare, but even if you don't see any flare, the light actually will, decrisp. It lowers the resolution.
Well, of course, one thing you see now in people using their phones to shoot high-end stuff, it may be that the specs for what the camera inside is doing are just fine, but they haven't cleaned the lens, and it goes everywhere with them, and it's greasy as
if you look at
get out.
If you look at the stuff, I mean, the professional stuff that has been shot on iPhones,
Right.
People are doing that, not just as a gimmick. Partly, if you're in a highly dynamic situation or a place where space isn't an issue, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In almost every case, they are using different lenses.
Yes.
They're not using the iPhone lens. They're putting
I see.
something over it
Yeah.
or replacing it.
Yeah.
So yes, you've got your iPhone, and yes, it has this quality. But if you're serious about it, you're going to not spend another $4,000 or $5,000
Right.
kitting it out.
Right.
It's like, well, not this, but we, when we're out doing things, I will take a Canon that is a video camera as well as being a still camera, and resolution's very good, but it just it's not quite the same
Yeah.
as as I can get with these things. These are fairly old cameras.
Yeah. So now tell me about the pure white background, green screen, all that kind of thing. Is that old hat, or is that still current
everything,
use? Yeah.
Green screen, blue screen, whatever. In the old days we called it chroma key, and I don't even know what it's mats. They're essentially it's a form of matting. Actually, part of the reason I have that Raven sitting up there is if I can get out of the construction business long enough, I want to do some animations. And the contextualization of the Raven will be with blue screen, green screen, whatever.
Yeah.
It is much easier now than it used to be. In the old days, particularly in video, it was a monstrous process to get a good image. You probably remember the old days when the weatherman standing in front of with a circle, the aura around him or her, particularly if it was a her and they had hair. There was this weird stuff that happened on the loose ends. A lot of that has changed. The technology of that is, that's one place where computer processing has made life much, much, much better. You can without major nosebleed get a very good mat that does not look like a mat.
Right.
And somewhere around here, I have both green and blue that someday is supposed to go here, so I can do all that sort of stuff. But it gives you, well, you've seen TED Talks.
Yeah.
That's sort of a high end of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they still have that problem of the screens and
Yeah.
the speaker.
Yes.
And they've done all the adjustment, but it's still awkward.
Yes. Yes, it is.
What am I supposed to look at?
Yeah.
And the core problem in that is, basically you can either do an event or you can do a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's sports, which is a
Right.
different, whole other
Right.
animal.
Right.
But if it's an event, then the event, the needs of the event should drive it. If it's a
Mm-hmm.
movie, the event should conform to the needs of the movie. We
Right.
ended up going to an awards event, I don't know, several years back in Atlanta that was basically black awards.
Mm-hmm.
And it went on forever. And the reason it went on forever is because they were blocking shots, they were lighting, and it is just stunningly boring for the audience to sit
But
through
it-
that
it
production.
makes a
But
good
it
movie.
was being produced
Yeah.
for television,
Yeah.
and the audience was
Secondary, tertiary,
scenery.
yes, or
at
not
best.
necessary at all. Yeah.
Behavior will use a soundtrack, crank up the applause.
Right.
And part of it is just deciding what you're here to do.
Right.
Are we here to make a movie? Let's do that. Are we here to have an event? Let's do that. Anything else, you're going to get a compromise.
Right.
It's you standing at a podium with screens behind you.
Right. Do you know anything about holographic presentation where the person isn't actually there, but you make them appear on stage? It's a thing heavily influenced by wind and also audience angle. It may look realistic straight on, but on the sides.
I know I've seen it. I'm vaguely familiar with the technology, but I have no idea how they're doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. The first TV appearance where I had a green screen there, I mean, that's literally what we were seeing. It was just a green thing. But when you saw us on TV, it was a beautiful cityscape, right? So what I noticed there is when I turned my head, there was something about my head shape that was odd. Or as my head turned, you weren't getting a normal appearance of this. Do you know what that was about? You can still see it. I can send it
That's not obvious.
to you. Yeah.
It's not obvious.
Yeah.
One of the problems with green screen, particularly, and I mean, if you're interacting with the space that is on the green screen,
Yeah.
and you can't see it,
Yes.
imagine
That's tough.
imagine if you will, there's a shark there, right there. No, not there, there. And hold that thought
at the
and
right
try to
thing.
and try to relate to that
Yeah.
shark as one would relate to a shark.
Yeah.
That's why they call it acting.
Yes. 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 Yeah.
I'm sort of about the movie making the way I am about the internet in general. I think Facebook has done a great deal of damage. I think it is. It's hard. There are a few things that are good. It has allowed people to stay in touch in ways that they were not able to stay in touch. Most of it extraneous, irrelevant, and a waste of time, but
Yeah.
at least it has allowed some people who are physically separated to maintain some connection. But the abuses of it, the fake news, the real fake news, like
Yeah.
Fox,
Sure. Yeah.
but also the stuff that people want. The problem now is that the technology has now got to a point that I can take your picture head on and in profile, and you can go away and I will put words in your mouth.
Yes. Yeah. And you, with a short video where I don't say any of the words that you're going to make me say, you can then create a video and make me say anything
Yeah.
with a very
So, it used to
small
be,
sample. Yeah.
If you can, if seeing is believing.
Yeah.
Not
It
anymore.
ain't. Yes.
I mean, you can, but you're going to deceive yourself. But that I mean, we're beginning to see that show up as news now.
Yeah.
And particularly fringe news. People are taking, it happened to Obama. It's happened to a variety of people, and there's just no way of knowing. Ultimately, it's interesting. I had this conversation with John Seely Brown. Do you remember John Seely Brown? John Seely Brown was at Xerox PARC in the early days, and he was the arch druid of basically the internet, computers. It was Xerox PARC that brought us the mouse.
Right.
And
Yes.
a lot of things.
Right.
There was a time when they were doing. I think it's much less now. I think they've sort of been left behind. But he was the guy at the center of all this, and we talked to him early on, and when we were producing the show. And somewhere in there, I said, you're looking at this. This is, you clearly have been able to see ahead, and your projections have been fairly reliable. It seems to me that at some point, what we're going to come down to is the quality of the editorial. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the source,
Right.
which is essentially what you're doing. It's what we've tried to do. If you believe, well, it's like a newspaper. I read the New Yorker as my principal news source because I find it much more reliable. I think they do the research. I think they have they're good writers. They have good fact checkers. I find it very reliable. The New York Times, much less so. I really don't like the New York Times, not the least because of their pretensions. But there are a few sources that are reliable, and I think we're going to get to that point where you simply can't believe it because it's on television or because it's on the internet or because it's on YouTube. Just because you see the picture doesn't mean that anything that what you're seeing actually happened in the real world.
Right. The whole thing about authentication, don't you think that there'll be extra types of that? I mean, there'll be things that you can't see in the video stream that will be like fingerprint or something. They guarantee that, or that for a short time will guarantee where it came from.
The digital fingerprint. I think at some point, the editorial, you want to know. You will find. I think we will get to the point where you essentially select material sources based on the editorial reliability of the organization, or whether it's whatever your metric is.
Right.
But from that, the problem then becomes exactly what you're saying. Is it in fact the New Yorker, or is it an imitation of the New Yorker?
Yeah.
And they, of course, are doing video as well, and the digital fingerprint or some equivalent. Yeah, I think you're probably going to have to do that.
Yeah.
The problem I have with Facebook specifically is I don't think Zuckerberg is nearly as smart as he thinks he is, and their basic business model is anathema, is antithetical to reliable information, and it's designed that way, and they keep patching it. And,
right. But now let me give back to you what you taught me yesterday and see, first of all, do I have this accurate? So Facebook is supported by ads. Right. Ads are lies that are trying to get you to do things that may not be in your best interest to do. That's what you said last night. Do you still feel that way?
There was Harry Evans, who is Harry Evans is one of the best journalists I've ever come across. He was voted by his peers the best editor of the 20th century, I think. Just a wonderful human being, very smart, honest. He's the one that finally made the British government acknowledge the problems with thalidomide. He just wouldn't let that. He sunk his teeth and spent years. And he's back trying to deal with Canada on the same subject. You've probably seen some of that. Harry Evans quoted to us somebody whose name I can't remember. News is something that somebody doesn't want you to know. Everything else is advertising. Well, it's like most aphorisms. There's some truth in it, but you don't want to push it too far. It is not absolute truth. It is, it's a shortcut.
Yeah,
it's sort of a mnemonic device. there's a distinction between, you know, trying to provide substantive information and making money.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unfortunately, the media in all of its manifestations, and it's always been a problem, it's just, you know, it's been exacerbated by the current technologies. There's always been a built-in conflict. That's why historically there was this iron wall between the editorial staff and the commercial side of the business.
Mm-hmm.
They did not even talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's gone. That's been gone for a long time.
Yes.
With television for a while, you at least had the FCC that was trying to, and the fairness doctrine and those kinds of things, which was always sort of a kludge, but at least they attempted. That's all gone out the window. If somebody's selling something, it's like the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And self-regulation doesn't work. And,
Yeah.
And the industry, of course, will say, well, we can, and that's what essentially the position Facebook is in now. You know,
Right.
they don't want to be regulated because it'll get into their pockets. So they're going to self-regulate. Well, no, they're not. Their instincts are all wrong. The business model is all wrong. The only way to make Facebook a respectable organization is to tear it down and start over.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to do that. They're
Yeah.
going to tinker with it. The
Yeah.
more they tinker, the worse it gets.
Right. So is humanity doomed then? to put it?
Well, I don't think so. I think
what is the outcome here?
Well, not the outcome. You know, this gets us into. Can't remember who it was. It said prophecy is basically a mug's game.
Yeah.
You don't want to go there. I think we're going to have to learn to deal with it, or it's going to eat us alive. We're on the down. I mean, we have the United States is paying a price for it. Canada's, you know, the world is paying a price for all this new technology that is out of control, and that we don't know how to individually or collectively control it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start talking about control, the question, you know, it's the question of who polices the police,
Yes.
which is a historic problem, goes back forever. And this is the same question. Who do you rely on? Do you want the government telling you what is true and what's not true? Well,
Right.
actually, you don't.
Yeah. The scariest thing, really, in terms of physical assault that ever happened to me in my life, I showed up at work early when I was an intern. I don't know, 5 o'clock, 5:30, and there was a security guard at the pop machine or something like that, just emptying it of coin and putting it in his pocket. I just backed out of there very quietly and walked away. I thought, holy shit, you know. And that is also, so the first office space that we rented, it was broken into, and nothing serious happened because we encountered the person, and it turned out the person was one of the security staff, and this was not like a security sweep,
Well,
you know.
that actually goes, among other things. The so-called criminal justice system in America, and I don't know that Canada's much better, is a mess.
Yeah.
It's racist, it's sexist, it is economically predicated, it's not justice.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you know, something called American justice exists is, you know, it exists in the breach.
Yeah.
Yes. And you know, I think it's why my focus increasingly is on culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cultural issue. Franz de Waal, a primatologist principally, good Dutch lad, with all the instincts of the Dutch.
Yeah.
Very dry, very, very scientific. Wrote a book years ago called Good Natured, and his work was principally with chimpanzees, both in the wild and actually he was at Yerkes. And he may still, I guess he still is at Yerkes. And his basic argument is, if you look at chimpanzees in social settings, you can see all the predicates of morality and ethics.
Mm-hmm.
It's all there. And the reason it's all there is you cannot survive in a community without rules.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules evolve, and then you can, and bring a god in to put the seal of approval on, or
Right.
bring down the tablets from the mountain
Right.
to provide some how to say, brute force behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Do that or you'll go to hell. So any social animal has to have rules.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't survive, and that's why the anarchists are really not among my favorite people. And we're not doing that very well. The communities are fragmented. People move around. The media, essentially, the media intermediates between individuals.
Right.
We get our information not from one another, not because we're out in the marketplace. I'm a great fan of pubs. It's not just the alcohol. And a real pub as opposed to a bar, which are very different animals, but England in the old days was just joy, because you could go to the neighborhood pub and you could learn at least as much there as you could at the British Museum. It was different.
Yeah.
But in terms of current conditions, you would learn more there certainly than you would reading the Times of London or watching
Right.
the BBC or whatever. We don't have those kinds of institutions anymore.
Yeah. So if we are searching for some group of people somehow or thoughts from groups of people to guide us, so is there anything to the idea of spiritual, not religious? Is that a thing? Are the people thinking good thoughts who don't have any religious affiliation or extra beliefs?
Oh yeah.
And how do you then identify those?
Well, I think when we were outside yesterday, we mentioned the religious case against belief.
Yes.
And his argument, I think, is about as compelling as anything I've heard. The world is not deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
That's an assertion, but there's substantial evidence that, starting with Heisenberg, if you care, but there are lots of reason to presume that the universe is not deterministic. There are physical rules that are going to apply anywhere, anywhen, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
Astrophysicists and particle physicists are still going around and around in that, but the evidence is they apply everywhere, everywhen. But that is until you get to life, and with life you get agency, and once you've got agency, and it could be blue-green algae, but you've got agency, then you're off into another wonderland. Biology sort of straddles that. There are rules, sort of, but these are extraordinarily complex systems. And when that's why the Darwinian piece is so important to Paula and me. I think Stuart Kaufman, having looked at it most of his career, came to all you can do is do your best. You can never know the outcome.
Yeah.
What he did not say, the corollary to that is you are therefore obligated to make your best the best that it can be, which is why your work is important. That's why we try to do what we do. It's not enough to say, well, that's the best I can do.
Yeah.
I dropped out of school when I was 5. That's the best I could do. This is not an excuse. It is the condition. But it's not sufficient to do your best. It is sufficient to do your best, having done your best to make your best the best it can be, which is a radically different animal. And it was part of, interesting, we were talking about Oberlin, and it's part of what is interesting to me about the age you and we are, is we should, if we have spent a lifetime essentially following that, at least including that as part of living, we should be further along the path. We should be, in a sense, wiser than we were when we were 10 years old, or 20 years old, or 30 years old, or 50 years old. And we should be sharing that. one of the great horrors, I think, of modern civilization is age segregation.
Yes.
It's what you were, all these people are 20 years old. That's
Right.
great. They need you, you need them.
Right. Yeah.
And we need more of that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a problem with the way we've set up our educational system. It's the problem with the way our communities have evolved. That's pools for kids.
Right.
This bar is for 55 plus. We've segmented, and we're getting no cross fertilization, which is we're not learning from each other.
But isn't it also a reality? Many older people feel under threat from other age groups. So they're not manifesting this wonderful creative wisdom that they in theory should have because they're too damn scared.
Well, it's fear. I think a lot of people buy into the idea that you hit 65, you retire, and your social utility goes to zero.
Yeah.
You are now in a pure consumer mode. You are not contributing. You're living off.
You're worthless.
The welfare of of the assembled masses.
Right.
And that's really what we were trying. I was trying to help Paula do at Oberlin is get some of these people. As we were saying last night, I think this the Parkland event, the Me Too. I think there's and the reaction to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And the reaction to Obama.
Mm-hmm.
The screaming racism. We now know that America is, large segments of it are screamingly racist. They're xenophobic, they're misogynist, they're racist. That's a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
And, and you have the option of opting out, or you have the option of doing whatever you know how to do to change it. Yeah. I think that people our age are a resource, and since we created a lot of those problems, as a community, as a society, there's an implicit obligation to use the time, and we have more time.
Yes. Yeah.
And the combination should be a tremendous asset. Unfortunately, in the West, and particularly in North America, and I think particularly in America, the mythology is you're out to pasture. You have nothing to contribute.
So we live in a world that seems like it's overwhelming about scarce resources and competing for them. Can you imagine a post-scarcity world? Do you ever think about that? Do you think there's any possibility of that
We mentioned
happening?
Frederick Fourier, the philosopher, and he had an interesting perspective, and he'd obviously thought about it. He wrote The Philosophy of Technology, and he was dead set against fusion energy. Mm-hmm. He thought it would be destructive, that to have an infinite source of energy available, that it would be destructive of humanity. I never quite understood what the core objection was, but he's very intelligent. I mean, he was a philosopher. He was not just a student of philosophy. He was a philosopher. I don't think it matters. I think that's a tangential problem.
Yeah.
I think part of what confuses us, we have become so obsessed with economic as the defining metric, which is why old people go out the door. You no longer have economic utility. You are therefore just a drain on society. Well, no, I may not have any economic utility. Other than spending down my whatever I've stashed away. Right. But there are all those other things that are important, and in fact arguably much more important than the economic piece. But we've gotten the standard, when we were consulting with large companies, rule one is you need to know what you're there to do. Right. Why are we in this swamp? And then you need to have metrics that reflect that appropriately. And though it turns out that's extraordinarily difficult for most organizations and for most people. One, to know why we're in the swamp. Well, I was born here. I don't know. Alligators, I don't know. But the other is the metric piece. And the metrics turn out, you bloody well better get your metrics right, because you're going to get what you measure. assuming a level of competence, which is not necessarily reliably the case in most corporations, but assuming you know what you're there to do and know you need to measure it, then you bloody well better get your metrics right, or bad things are going to happen. And if you look at most organizations, there's a problem with being clear about what we're here to do, and then there's a problem with measuring what that is. And the standard idea is drive it all back to economics, because you can count it, it's quantifiable, it's, you know, the nominal function of a business is that is, you know, legally that's their responsibility, it's their only responsibility. That's changing, fortunately. But if you measure the wrong things, bad things happen. And that's what we're doing.
So what about, like in the movie business, you're interested in audience reaction, right? You can look at, you know, sales of tickets to the movies that you produce, but that's a pretty crude metric. So don't you think we will reach a point where, like, you can start with a test audience and you can measure the pheromones and all sorts of things?
They've been doing that for years.
Does that produce anything useful?
The people who do the metrics are doing real well. It's the classic, you know, it works sort of.
Yeah.
But if you look at the really first-rate stuff, a lot of it took years to catch on. I mean, Van Gogh couldn't sell a painting. Only his brother was the only person who would buy a Van Gogh painting.
Yeah.
Well, now they're, you know, you put several zeros behind it.
Yeah.
It's,
well,
that is a very conservative approach.
Right.
It's static.
Let's look at focus groups and Steve Jobs, right? He didn't use them. So I would presume that if he had, the stuff that he produced would have been much less, you know,
it would have been less
useful.
It would have been,
or
it would not have had the impact.
Yeah.
Apple would not be Apple. It would not be as big as it is, because he had the courage and the obduracy to do it his way. And it turns out his way, in a lot of ways, Apple is not as wonderful as it thinks it is, but then who is? But his willingness to go against the grain. And when we're in, this is the Darwinian piece. It operates over time. And, you know, essentially we tend to think statically. I mean, it's part of what you're trying to deal with. People don't want to deal, you know, they don't want to look down the road. They want to look. My metaphor is, you know, it's skiing looking at your feet.
Yeah.
That's going to get you in trouble. I can promise you. It's going to get you in the trees, and you'll be dead, or off a cliff, or something.
Right.
We need to, I think, be smarter about dealing with dynamics. There's something that's been sort of kicking around in my head forever that I've never spent any time on. I think you can write a history, which I've never seen done, a history of the species based on amplification. And in a very real sense, the history of the human species, the things we're proudest of, the things that we now assume make us human, you know, the toolmaker thing. But the whole process from fire forward, flint and fire, flint napping and fire, is an exercise in amplification, amplifying the relatively weak. We're a very puny chimpanzee.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, chimpanzees are really strong.
Yeah.
You don't want to mess with a chimpanzee.
No. You may know this, but it's really a shocking fact. So now in the era of face transplantation, some of those patients are people where they have a pet chimp who ripped their face off. I mean, that's something you and I can't easily do, but a chimp can.
Well, what they say is, I think this is based on science. I don't think it's just a rule of thumb. Both chimps and bonobos, and presumably orangs, and presumably gorillas, are more or less basically 5 times stronger pound for pound than humans.
Right.
We were sitting one day with Kanzi was in his space, and we were sitting out in our space, and we were chatting and talking, and Kanzi was with Sue, she had her lexicgram, and they were chatting back and forth, and she was translating. So, and he was sitting on a log that they had in the enclosure, and she was sitting on a log, and he was sitting there. And what I realized after about 30 or 40 minutes is he was shredding the log. He was just pulling it apart. And by the time we left, that end of the log was not there anymore.
Yeah.
And he wasn't mad at him. He was just sort of, it's like, twiddling your thumbs. You shredded the log. But everything we're dealing with is a process of amplification. Thermonuclear weapons, serious amplification. The internet, serious amplification.
Right. Let me tell you something about me that's sort of interesting. My business, Transpath Inc., since I created the standard in transplant pathology, pharma is interested in my reading of the slides from clinical trials. But you'd say, well, okay, so obviously you train other people. No. It's always been me. There is no amplification. So, and they've got sort of used to that. It makes a kind of different business. So, it started out, Dr. Solez himself is reading these slides. Yeah, that's the whole deal, So, how different would it be if I trained 100 people? Well, I guess if we got to the point where the volume exceeded what I could look at, I would have to do that. But when I described that to people who are training people in entrepreneurship, that's just the most ridiculous thing. There's no amplification. You run a company and it's you. There's no amplification factor. Yeah.
The whole training racket.
Yeah.
I think we said something about having done work in diversity. We were working for a large company. Diversity was very trendy for a while. We had to have more black people and more women and something.
Right.
So we spent a lot of time understanding the organization, top to bottom. Research. We hired a fellow at UMass to do a literature search on a variety of things. Oddly, starting with productivity. Productivity is one of those things everybody talks about. Nobody knows what it is.
Yes.
There's a joke that we have agreed to, which is basically take whatever throughput of whatever organization, divide by the number of people, and that's productivity. Okay, do I know anything? No. It's a syllogism essentially.
Yeah.
It's an over-examined syllogism. But we developed a fairly sophisticated and I think potentially effective. And they said, "This is great. Who else is doing it?" Well, nobody's doing it. That's why we had to create it. Well, they wanted to be leaders, but they didn't want to be leaders.
The leaders.
They said
there has to be a precedent.
Well, they gave us a shitload of money to wander America.
Right.
At that time, Fortune was publishing the 50 best companies to work for in America.
Right.
50 most effective, the most diverse companies. So we took the Fortune list and went shopping. We went to Apple. We went to GE. We went to Motorola. We went to all over the damn place. To probably half of those companies. And it was an interesting exercise. One, benchmarking is a significant concept, or it was, and I assume it's still used, those words are used. The problem with benchmarking is that most of it was not benchmarking, it was industrial tourism. Correctly, benchmarking is what we ended up doing, which is you know what you're doing, or what you want to do, and you compare that with what somebody else is doing, and and they learn from you and you learn from them. We would show up at these places, and then inevitably it was in the HR department, which is what gets me thinking about it. Two things. We learned early on that you could walk in the door and have a pretty good idea of whether what we were seeing was functional greenwash, or it was substantive.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell by the way people walked, the way they interacted. You could tell by the receptionist. You could tell by the signs on the door. You could read it like you'd read a person, but it's more blatant. And then we would go to the assigned person, almost always a minority, because that's what you did with minorities, is hire them, your token female, preferably black female, because you could check 2 boxes. Yeah. And if you could get a black gay, well, actually not, because nobody would talk about gay at that time. Yeah. This was mid-90s, I think. Even San Francisco went to Levi Strauss, and I thought, surely they would be comfortable.
Yeah.
Even they were not comfortable with it. But we would walk in, they would do the corporate pitch, and then we would sit down in their office and close the door, and then they would tell us what was really going on, and it had nothing to do with what the PR was. And in almost every case, they said, you were so far ahead of what we were trying to do. And it turned out what they were doing was balanced workforce, which is, one from this category, one from, which even that doesn't work because, balanced as with respect to what? To the population, to your customer base, to your aspirational customer base. 12% of your customers are convicted felons. Does that mean you're supposed to hire 12% of your workforce as convicted felons?
Right. Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
And so it was a much more complicated process than we would have expected. And the company we were working for, we were working through their HR department. And what we came back with, what we learned, was not welcomed. So basically, number one, is that the problem is in the HR department. I'm sorry, but it is universally the case. It's not really the HR department's fault, because they are essentially the whipping boy for senior management. Mm-hmm. And anytime they've got a problem with any of these kinds of things, race, gender, anything that has to do with, a people problem,
right,
you blame HR. You call in HR, they can't fix it because the manager is an ass.
Yeah.
And they won't deal with that, so the HR ends up being the fall guy. But the core, until you fix the relationship between the operating side of the organization and the people side of the organization, right. You're whistling in the wind, and the end result is nothing has happened. I mean, we've got Starbucks closing down for a half a day because they behave the way they always behave. Is anything going to change? No. And in some ways, in many cases, going to the subject of training, you take people out of their natural environment, you put them in this alien space, you preach at them for a day or two or a week or whatever the party is. In some cases, the more aggressive version has you role playing. I'm going to pretend I'm black, and you're going to pretend you're a girl or a lesbian. God, right. Let's go all out. Right. And we're going to have basically low rent encounter sessions with right. people. I'm skeptical of it, even when they're not nominally professionally done, but these are not professionals.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, you do minimal damage. But then, having done that, you then send them back into precisely the same environment they came out of, mm-hmm. and expect something to change. And of course, you do it individually. So within a week, it's all gone. And the training industry, I think there's some good people. I think their hearts are in the right place.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like people that go into psychology because they're not well.
Isn't it? Part of this is a matter of checklists, and people never talk about the need to act. There actually are checklists. It's not just a metaphor, right? And so, once they've checked that box, if they have gender equity problems in the company and they set up training sessions, even if the training sessions don't do anything, they earn huge benefit from being able to check that box, right?
Yeah. And this is the metric problem.
Yeah.
It's essentially bad metrics.
Yeah.
And a tremendous amount of money and time and other resources have gone into that, and the marginal difference and ultimately it goes back to the leadership. If the people in charge are decent human beings, and unfortunately the selection process criteria in corporate America, I mean there are psychiatrists that assert that you basically have to be a sociopath in order to become a senior executive. In my experience, that's largely true.
Yeah.
Varying degrees of it, but these, I mean, Trump's an extreme example of it. But in some ways, he is the reduction to absurdity of the corporate universe. He was never in a corporation. The idea that he somehow is a
Business
businessman. Give me a break. He's a low rent con man.
Yeah.
Actually, what he is I think, almost certain, that he has been laundering money for the Russians for 2 decades. And I don't think he knows it. I think he thinks people do business, we're doing business with him. And of course the hotel industry is a wonderful way to launder money. Land, but particularly hotels, and there's all sorts of ways you can lose money and launder money. I think he thinks they're doing business with him because he's a great businessman, and he's brilliant, and he's charming, and whatever the hell else. And I think he really doesn't know that he's laundering money. And I almost guarantee that when Mueller gets through with him, you're going to see this long list, and it's going to come down to money laundering.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, you can look at his history in New York City, and it's there. I mean, he was mobbed up from the beginning.
Yeah.
But he's not a mafia don.
Yeah.
He's aspirational. He's a street thug.
Yeah.
Without the courage of a street thug.
Yes.
My take.
Yeah. Yeah. So, while we have this opportunity, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? I've kind of directed things a little bit there. Well, like any thoughts you have about what I'm doing and Sage, advice about it? Or?
One of your presentations, you were talking about AI, and I think singularity was in the. I don't think you used it in that sentence, and the word you used was inevitable. That I disagree with. I don't think anything this is the agency piece.
Right.
I don't think anything's inevitable.
Well, no. I mean, we live in an uncertain world, and you could imagine various catastrophes we both hope don't happen that could put us back in the Stone Age or worse.
Or just, I mean, the path though. I mean, the kinds of things we've been talking about. if we're going to get through the knothole that we're in, and that was I think E.O. Wilson saying, we're in a knothole in history. We got some serious challenges. We need to grow up as a species.
Yeah.
That was his phrase. We're still behaving like children.
Right.
Irresponsible, and it insults children.
Right.
Most children don't have thermonuclear devices. And we're going to have to come to terms with ourselves as a species. I think we're going to have to come to terms with the whole notion of ecology. I think is very important. We are not separate from nature. We are a product of nature. We are in nature. Right. The things we treat as artificial are artificial only in an artificial sense.
Yeah.
These are all natural. I mean, this is the amplification process. Right. We're obviously operating at orders of magnitude, at least in terms of velocity, but also in terms of impact. And this is why global warming is such an issue. And it's why people don't believe it, because how could that possibly be? And then there's, God gets involved in it. But we are now, have amplified our powers well beyond our ability. I mean, this is a Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yeah.
I've got a copy of Fantasia in there that I'm going to be. Yeah. One of these days, I'm going to go back and watch
that. Was one of my favorites as a child. So I still remember that.
We ought to bring it back. There's some lessons. That and Dr. Strangelove.
Right. I have that as well. Yeah.
There's one more.
The one hand holding the one hand holding the.
Oh, and that goes to something you were asking about, the metric on movie making. It depends on what. I mean, different people do things for different reasons. I mean, you do pathology because for reasons that the next pathologist doesn't do that. I would assume that there are some personality characteristics, there are clusters for a variety of different reasons, but ultimately there's a lot of individual in that. And the same thing in the movie business. I got into television because I thought the world was in deep sneakers, and that the media, the stories we tell, we are a storytelling species,
Right.
are central to who and what we are and what we will become. The stories we're telling now are bad stories. The good news is there are some important stories being told, some good stories being told, because we are members of SAG and AFTRA. They send out the movie nominees. Either they make them available on the internet or they send us DVDs.
Right.
Most of them. It's up to the studio whether they do that or not. But it gives us a chance once a year to see the nominees for the SAG Awards. SAG Awards are looking at the scripts and the actors. I mean, focused on the acting, of course. But what that means is you don't get Star Wars.
Yeah.
You don't get Gee Whiz. You don't get Bang Bang. You don't get a great deal of sex. It is the stories and the acting of those stories. This last season was remarkable. And the season before that I mentioned Arrival, which was one I would never have seen it otherwise. I don't think. But almost everything was dealing at a substantive storytelling level with the real world that we inhabit, even if they were artificial worlds. Those are stories that need to be told, and the story. The nice thing about movie making, particularly a well-crafted movie, is we learn from experience. What you can do is essentially create synthetic experiences, and if you do it well, they are compelling synthetic experiences that functionally cease to be synthetic. They become a part of who and what you are.
Right.
And becomes your life story.
Yeah.
And that affects how you see the world around you. Because it's a mass medium, it has effect across the entire culture. And part of the challenge is to make sure we're telling good stories. And by good, I mean well crafted, well thought out, responsible, ambiguous stories. And if we do that well enough, long enough, successfully enough, we might survive.
Yeah.
If we don't,
that's my hope too.
If we don't, well, people. As long as we've been, particularly once we started producing the show and talking to the people we talked with, always ask me, well, what's going to happen in the election, or what's going to happen here, or what's going to happen there, because I'm supposed to be able to see because I read newspapers and talk to people, and some of them are people that they read about in the newspaper, so I'm supposed to have special insight. And I finally realized that I kept trying to answer their question. I finally realized that was stupid. The correct answer is it depends on what you do.
Yes.
This is the agency piece. I'm sorry, folks. But there's no magic bullet. If you turn it over to somebody else, you're going to end up with something like Donald Trump, God forbid.
Yeah.
Should actually, pretend to be president. And if you don't get off your hands and get out of your little cocoon and get off your computer and stop playing Facebook and get out there and do the things necessary to change what you don't like and learn from people who see it differently, but
Right.
The important thing we walked away from with that exercise in diversity, the benchmarking that we did and the research we did and all the work that went with it. It turns out in a dynamic environment, and this seems to be generally the case, in a dynamic environment, a diverse workforce can be very useful. In a static environment, it's more trouble than it's worth. The conflicts that come just naturally with people who are different is counterproductive. But in a dynamic environment, having those multiple perspectives is very important. With a major caveat, there has to be a predicate that is. This was the best articulation was actually better than what we had come up with. But same idea, different words. A woman then at Wharton, now is I think at Oxford, had Eddie Jen had told us, had done a very a 12-person study, which from a scientific perspective, there's a certain. It's not, how to say, totally reliable, but what she had come up with on the basis of the work she had done, and other things, it wasn't just that. She had characterized diversity in a variety of different ways. There's gender diversity, there's experiential diversity, there's values diversity. You can slice and dice it lots of different ways, but these were roughly the categories she'd come up with. A diverse workforce is effective if the values are shared. That is to say, not value diversity. Now, value is a very ambiguous term in that context. But if you have shared values in a dynamic environment,
then the whole thing can work.
Then having that rich, complex group of people becomes a powerful tool.
Yeah.
And it's that values piece, and of course values are sort of our shorthand, our editorial summary, the abridged version, the executive summary of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's what culture is about. Culture it says what's appropriate behavior and what's inappropriate behavior.
Right.
There's a social piece of that, but that's what it comes down to. We don't have that. We don't have a culture. In any meaningful way. Richard Slotkin, who spent his career studying basically American culture through American literature, said to us, and not everybody agrees with it, said, the American myth died in Vietnam, which is arguable, but you can see what he was talking about. And he said, any candidate replacement for that, and we've got to have one, and we don't. We've got a lot of dumb stories. We've got some cartoons floating around, one of whom happens to be in the White House, but it's not a funny cartoon. Any candidate for a new American myth has to address slavery, race, the history of slavery, race, and connects to that. And it has to address violence.
Mm-hmm.
Who has it, who controls it, who gets to make decisions with respect to violence. That's a pretty tall order.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's probably right. And there, you can slice and dice in lots of different ways, but particularly with respect to America, but more broadly, I think the species, the other, is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And race is our particular problem in America. Less, I think, in most other parts of the world, but not necessarily. And the Chinese are great racists. The Japanese are great racists. Mm-hmm. Do not be confused. It is not a uniquely American phenomenon. What is unique is the chattel slavery for all those years, and the compromises that the Constitution embedded in the founding documents that essentially are predicated on chattel slavery. That's going to be that's a challenge. We have not addressed that, and then the whole issue of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And the role of the NRA it's sort of an indicator. I don't think it is a controlling function. It is an indicator of the deep problem in the community. Neither of those we're even close. We do not have that mythology.
Yeah.
I think I am still hopeful that Obama, in his new career, whatever it is, Obama's going to be a television star.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be he and Michelle are going to be producing television, which I think is going to be a very interesting exercise to watch. He's a bright guy. I will be very surprised if he doesn't do something that will move us down that path.
Mm-hmm.
The movie industry, a small portion of it, the stuff that we get to see that is acting and scripting, is doing some very good work. And then there's all the other stuff around it.
Right.
There's some stuff being done on television, breaking up the three principal networks. That's a great step forward. It now allows lots of other voices to be out there. Netflix is producing stuff. Amazon is producing. Every Time, Dick, and Harry is producing stuff, and it can be distributed. We can bypass a lot of the economic drivers in ways that has not historically been the case before. The challenge is whether that the inevitable consolidation that wants to. I mean, Amazon wants to rule the world. Google wants to run the world. Netflix wants to run it. Facebook wants to run it, and they're all in movie business.
Yeah.
Plus lots of others. Now Disney is going to do what everybody wants a piece of that because there's so much money in it, or at least the illusion of it. But at the very least, from that, and until it gets consolidated again, we're getting some really interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen it, but The Handmaid's Tale is, I think, part of the contributor to the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
It set a predicate. I think part of the reason that Obama ended up in the White House was the West Wing.
Yes.
I don't know how much of that you watched,
No,
but it was
something.
it was extraordinarily well produced, and they had a plausible candidate that was Hispanic, that I think actually ended up winning. And I think both the program, its popularity, the serial quality of it, and the having an Hispanic in a principal role as a potential president, I think was worth 2 percentage points.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, 2's all it takes.
You know,
if they're the right 2.
Things are so close. Well, I want to thank you very much for this. I think if we keep on, our spouses will probably feel we've abandoned them. Yeah.